Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, your moderator this evening. Joining me is historian and director of Handheld Press, Kate MacDonald, and our guest speaker, Becky Brown of Curtis Brown Heritage. Please enjoy Literary Agents and Dead Authors.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. Let me introduce us. My name is Kate MacDonald. I am, as Sarah said, I'm director of Handheld Press and a literary historian. And today I have special guest, Becky Brown from Curtis Brown Heritage. She is a literary agent, and like me, she is an archive mole. We spend a lot of time burrowing in archives looking for authors. So I'm going to start by asking Becky a question. Can you explain what a literary agent is?
Firstly, hello, thanks for having me. 99% of literary agents would say that they are the representative of an author. So they are sort of going into battle for authors every day in the sort of arena that includes publishers, marketing people, publicity people, booksellers, readers. But for me and approximately 4 other people in the world, we are advocates for the kind of ghosts, I guess. You know, we are looking after the legacies of dead writers, and we are explaining the publishing industry and all the myriad processes therein to their beneficiaries, who might be a widow or a widower, their children, their grandchildren, a charity, could be literally any sort of personal or professional body that has inherited those rights. And we also do a lot of other stuff like, we pitch books that are out of print for reissues. We try and sell the rights in those books to film producers, TV producers, audiobook makers, people that make board games. It can really be, it's a vast landscape. You can kind of sell anything to anyone if you try hard enough.
I think there's one word in there that might still need a bit of explaining, and that is rights. Can you explain what rights are?
Yes. So, this is all, I guess, conceptually quite weird, but so like, if I have a book, this is my nearest book to hand, the blur doesn't help, but this is Nina Borden's novel, Tortoise by Candlelight, and that exists as a physical book, but actually the underlying existing thing is copyright, and that is Nina Borden's right as its author to profit from what she has created, and that right, which kind of exists as this sort of non-physical thing, was handed down to her beneficiaries. So when I talk about selling rights, that can be anything from the right to publish that book, the right to make a TV series out of that book, the right to quote from that book in your book. It can be it is a vast spectrum of ways in which someone might engage with that material.
And you get different rights for audiobooks, ebooks, dramatic rights, films.
Yeah,
fluffy slippers.
Yeah, much. Straight reading for the radio, the right to translate it and publish it in other countries and other languages, the right to render it in Braille, but it can be anything.
Right. No pun intended, right. And you also talked initially about challenges, explaining, you go out into battle on behalf of the estate of an author. And given that rights are so extraordinarily complex, do you also have to battle for dominance over those rights? I'm thinking particularly of books that we published that we had world rights for, but then we discovered that an American publisher had published their own version, even though we had the rights. Do you ever have to go and battle in that sort of situation?
Yeah, there are real complexities there, and I think we meet with them more often with dead writers than you probably do with living writers, in that sometimes, some very well-meaning person somewhere in the world might think that because an author is dead, they don't need to ask or to give any of the proceeds of that publishing or whatever other type of product they might have made to someone. But actually, most countries are part of something very boring called the Berne Convention, but that is very essential, that agrees that a writer and a writer's heirs have the ability to control who gets to use their work and in what capacity for their whole lifetime, and then 70 more years after their death. And so that American thing, like, that's super common, particularly because there are points in American history where copyright law changed and maybe someone might not have renewed the copyright. Or, it's incredibly dry and cobwebby. but it is, you know, an actual matter of kind of legal stuff, in the same way that, like, you know, not marrying two people is.
Yeah.
You know, they're literally like, you know, a publisher will license the exclusive right to be able to print and sell a book in a certain territory. And so sometimes you can get these awful moments where you realize that two people have Israel and they're both trying to sell their books there, and that's your fault.
Oh, that's dreadful. Oh gosh, yes. And from a publisher's point of view, from my perspective, it's dreadful. If you really, like, I was trying to put together a collection of short stories by a dead author, and I found that 3 of the stories I could not use because their rights had already been taken by another publisher doing a completely different collection. And because they're short stories, there's an awful lot of overlap. And that meant my collection just couldn't happen because these were the 3 best stories, which is probably why someone else had already got them. So you work for Curtis Brown Heritage. Curtis Brown is one of the biggest Anglophone literary agencies, certainly in Britain. Would you say also in the States, or?
We are the largest agency in Europe.
Okay, that's enormous.
Yes, and you know, which is our whole continent, so that gives some scale. And I guess, I mean, now we probably are one of the, I mean, I would say globally we're probably in the top 3 in terms of sheer size. But I mean, for literary estates alone, I look after 150 of them. And we actually recently got this crazy piece of tech that fed all my spreadsheets together, and I found out that that's 4,123 books.
Oh,
so and those date from, and you know, the earliest of them were written in the late 1800s. The latest were written, I mean, we look after one that isn't published yet, that was only written last year. So, you know, it really is, it follows the entire, I mean, Curtis Brown is 124 years old. So it's, yeah, anything in those 124 years might theoretically fall under my remit.
So the one, you said one of these books, the earliest one was written around the early 1800s. Why are you still managing a book that was written so long out of copyright?
So those ones that are that far back, there's a quirk of law that means that if the book wasn't published until after the author died, the 70 years actually start at the point of publication. So we represented Thomas Hardy when he was alive, and obviously most of his work is long out of copyright, but some things, like kind of ephemeral things that he never published, that were published much later, still bring in royalties, which actually go to a really lovely Hardy Museum in Dorset.
Oh,
so
yes,
they do good
Dorchester.
things.
Yes.
Yes, Dorchester, that's right. Yeah.
Well, that is amazing. I knew that unpublished works, you doesn't matter when the works were written, they always are under copyright. But I had not realized that, good Lord, yes, that would bring in books that are almost 200 years old. And can you also explain about renewal of copyright? Because the law, as I understand it, normally is a work comes out, an author comes out of copyright on the 1st of January in the year following the 70th year after their death. But some big estates, for example, George Orwell, that estate is the classic case where the Orwell estate made very sure that the copyright was extended because they didn't want to relinquish control. Does that happen very often?
No, and that's a really interesting one. So there are like a few sort of tricks that you can do. So for example, if you co-authored something with someone, you can actually like link the rights together. So, you know, if say you wrote a picture book in collaboration with an illustrator, and you die terribly, you know, in some terrible tragedy when you're in your 40s, but the illustrator lives to, you know, the grand old age of 88, you might be able to say, actually, that's a joint copyright, and everyone has the right to continue to have that until 70 years after the illustrator's death. Sometimes there's just like with Orwell, a lot of Orwell is out of copyright in the UK, but there are American laws that mean that it's still in copyright in America for the next 20 years. It's all, yeah, it's very complex. But I mean, at the other end of that, it's interesting, like the actual like, you know, that's the legality. But when you look at it, I guess from a kind of ethical perspective, there are lots of weird things that come into that. Like, for example, if the beneficiaries of an estate disappear, something can become what we call an orphan work. where no one's allowed to profit from it. And that can actually stop really wonderful books from being available because no one knows where to send the money, which is, you know, on one hand, like a huge part of my job is defending copyright and making sure, you know, that someone's children or grandchildren get to you know, decide what happens and to, you know, enjoy the sort of proceeds of what, you know, their father or mother or grandmother has left for them. But yeah, at the other end of it, it can end up being really prohibitive and mean that wonderful things aren't available for people to read, which is awful.
It's really sad. And it's
Mm.
because there is no one to claim, therefore nobody may benefit at all. So
Yeah,
there's just no way around it.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, you know, it's sort of, I feel like copyright, you know, no one in publishing talks about copyright very often. I'm sure this is probably the only Zoom in which someone has given copyright more than 90 seconds ever. But actually it is the lifeblood of the industry. Like, you know, if copyright ceased to exist, nobody would be able to write anymore unless they had, you know, independent means. And it would massively, it would destroy, you know, the diversity of what you're able to read. The whole ecosystem would collapse. So it's really important. Although that doesn't mean it's interesting.
No, well, I do find it interesting. I also love the fact that it's very egalitarian. Any author and illustrator, photographer, artist, they have copyright if they make a creative work. And
Yes,
it
from the
doesn't matter,
moment it comes into being, that is theirs.
and it doesn't matter how much money they have or how good they are or how good it is, it's their copyright. And that's an asset, it's a valuable thing. So talk us through how you will try and place a work that's by a dead author.
Oh, yeah,
so
that's
can you expect publishers to already know that author, or do you try and educate a publisher and try and woo them by saying, have you read this? And
well, I mean, those are kind of two separate questions. I'll start with how do I go about it, which is that, so again, like 95% of my kind of agent colleagues would be choosing from a vast number of editors in every publishing house you can think of. And so in publishing, we have, you know, what we call the big five, which are the massive corporate publishers that are kind of, you know, actually now composite entities that, you know, own lots and lots of other things that used to be independent publishers, but are now just imprints. So, you know, now you have Penguin Random House and you have Hachette and you have HarperCollins and Macmillan and one more that I always forget.
Schuster?
Probably, yeah.
The other one,
who don't have someone that publishes old books, which is why I never remember them. But and that leads me rather neatly to the fact that I work in a much smaller universe with kind of, you know, I would say fewer than 20 editors and publishers who are really passionate about reissuing old books and who bring a vast amount of knowledge to that. And that, you know, spans from editors at Penguin Classics through to kind of the larger independent publishers like Faber, through to sort of really, you know, sort of one person operations. So naming no names. And so what I do when I, you know, when I find something that I really love, is I will think, right, which editor within those 20 places is going, you know, is going to align with this in a kind of taste sense, like who's going to be excited by it, and then will they know the writer? And actually, I think increasingly it's quite a good thing if they don't, because then I get to say, look at this wonderful thing I've discovered for you, rather than like, here's this brilliant author you already know about who's suddenly available. But you know, both there are real pros and cons, because, you know, if I'm bringing someone, a writer that not only they've heard of, but that their sales team, their marketing team have heard of, then that name recognition really helps. They're like, ah, yes, you know, I read that by her as a child, or that was on my university syllabus. And that can be really useful because that gives a kind of immediate, like, it ticks a box. But I think everyone can get really excited about something where it's a name that means nothing to them, but the book is really extraordinary. So yeah, pros and cons about the kind of knownness. And I think, you know, obviously people who are working in reissues are going to be reading a lot of 20th century writing, so they're more likely to know about the writer than, say, you know, your kind of standard person on the street. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're famous. And, you know, the vast majority of the writers I work with are relatively obscure in some sense. You know, they are not household names.
And for publishers like me, that makes them all the more interesting, because that means they could be real treasures. Yeah. We had, when we met, you and I, you invited me out for coffee because you wanted to pitch some of the treasures in the Curtis Brown heritage. And we talked about, yes, it was Margaret Kennedy. And that was really very interesting, because I hadn't thought very much about Margaret Kennedy until you mentioned her. And then the filing cabinet in my brain went ping. And I remembered that at a conference 15 years earlier, I'd heard someone mention this obscure memoir about the Second World War that she had published in America, but had never been published in Britain. And I asked you, and I dimly remember you thought, oh, I've never actually read this. Quick, cover up. How do I get around this one? Was that the case?
No, do you know, actually, no, do you know what? That wasn't the case, because I've been researching, so I was very new to the job at that point, and I've been given, and I have been remiss to not mention up to this point that I co-agent almost all of our writers with Nora Perkins, who is was at Curtis Brown before I joined. And Nora said, okay, you know, to start off with, here are kind of 60 writers that, you know, that you can kind of, you know, get going with by yourself. And Margaret Kennedy was one of the few that I knew, you know, where I had a copy of one of her books at home and I'd read her and I admired her. So I was like, right, well, she's an early one that I'll start with. But what was really interesting about this particular book, which you eventually licensed from me, and which is called Where Stands a Winged Century, is that so throughout kind of Curtis Brown, as like the history of Curtis Brown, as agents had handed down their lists to one another when they retired, this title wasn't on the lists. And it was because that those lists were of books that had been published in the UK. And this particular memoir had been only published in America. And the way that I had found it is that when I was trying to put together blurbs on the more obscure of her books, you know, so sort of just bits of copies so that I could actually understand what they were about, because when, you know, when you represent 4,000 books, you can't hope to read them all. I was going, so one of my tactics is I go backwards through time on aid books, and I look, because you can go, and if a seller has been kind enough to upload their own photos, you can sometimes find an original blurb on a dust wrapper that isn't written down anywhere on the internet. And I saw the book and I was like, well, that can't be right. It's not on any of my lists, and it's not on her Wikipedia page. It doesn't make sense. And then I started, you know, I have a London library membership, which is the most wonderful resource and allows me, absolutely extraordinary. And the book was mentioned on her author profile page on a resource called Orlando, which traces the history of women's writing in the UK. And so that was what told me what it was. And then I bought a copy from America, and it turned up. And by the time you and I met, it hadn't arrived yet, so I hadn't read it, but I did know it existed, and so I did know what it was about, but I hadn't read it. It's a very convoluted way of saying I did know what I was doing.
Yeah. Oh, it was good. It was, I mean, that was the start of a great working relationship. So tell us about some, I mean, you've already told us about one of the big frustrations of the job, which is when there is no heir, there is no estate, you're stuck in this fabulous book. What about some of the joys? What makes you so happy? Not just selling a wonderful book for a huge amount of money, but
which I never do, by the way. I only sell, I mean, in the kind of you know, in the sort of old books landscape, the huge amounts of money don't come out of their coffers. It's very, I mean, but actually that is kind of a nice part about it, because I think all of us are doing it for love, but also I think, you know, the joy is that kind of moment of discovery, like that, you know, that's always there. It's opening something that very few people have read for a very long time, and being not only like finding out that you found something new that you love, having that moment of being like, I know how to sell this, like I know how to explain to an editor why this needs to be published. I know how they're going to explain to their sales team why booksellers need to buy it into an independent bookshop and put it on a table, and knowing that, you know, and I have several very dear friends who are booksellers, and who, you know, I go into my local bookshops in Bath and I watch them, you know, sell books, and you know, being able to follow that kind of pitch in your head right through to the end, and know that actually I know exactly how, you know, my friend Ed at Mr. B's is going to be able to convince, you know, a sort of 65-year-old man in Bath to buy this book. It's that kind of, you know, and I guess like all, you know, all readers who love reading and love talking about books sort of that's what you want when you read something extraordinary. You want to press it into the hands of other people. And what's great about my job is that I can kind of by proxy theoretically press it into thousands of hands. And to kind of go back to Margaret Kennedy, a book of hers called The Feast, which I sold to a brilliant editor at Faber, has now sold over 25,000 copies, and that has been translated into umpteen languages. And that had been just mouldering for decades, and it's this wonderful murder mystery. It's not a murder, but it's, I don't know. I'm not going to pitch it to anyone, but I am going to say it is a completely joyous, like 1950s book set in Cornwall about the collapse of a cliff onto a hotel. And it just, watching people talk about it on the internet, which they still do, is such a joy to me, because I know that like my first moment of mentioning it to the editor is the reason that 25,000 people have read the paperback, and however many thousand people have read the ebook, and and fingers crossed it's going to be a TV series, and it's that kind of
gosh, and the Kennedy family will be quite pleased.
Actually, what's lovely with Kennedy is that she left her royalties to English Pen, who do incredible work advocating for writers around the world. So it also has a wonderful kind of impact in that sense too.
When the money goes to a very good cause, not just an anonymous person, that is also a good thing.
It really is.
So what happens when a will can't be found, when we know a novel exists and we know who the author is, but there is no title chain? How do you work through that?
I mean, that also actually, and I probably shouldn't say that it's one of my favorite things about my job, because it makes me sound just like a snoop, but there are so many. I mean, it's wonderful to kind of to get a mystery like that in your hands and try to crack it. And there are lots of things I do. I've traced beneficiaries by sort of writing to someone who left a comment on an online obituary page, saying like, dear so-and-so, I miss them so much, and you write to them and they're like, oh, well, actually, I can't find their family. And they'll write back and say, oh, well, actually, I know her daughter, and that, so you can, I've phoned people, I've written to estate agents and said, a beneficiary I've lost lived here 10 years ago. Like, do you have any details from selling their house? And they'll be like, yes, you can write to this address, or, and when you do finally, and I mean, by no means do you always finally, I probably have about 30 estates who I have just hit a massive dead end with. But the ones where you do stitch those pieces together and you kind of reunite someone with something that they may not even know that they had. And that can be really exciting. And often it kind of reforges a connection to that person for them, and they go back into their books and be like, oh, that was my like beloved uncle or my godfather, or
I wonder sometimes the thrill of the chase, and I'm completely with you on the excitement of chasing down the probate and where did this person live. The thrill of the chase can itself be so alluring and so much the focus that you rather lose sight of whether the book is actually any good, which is actually a publisher's problem, not an agent's problem. So the detective work of involving yourself in the author's life and trying to find out all you can, that is dangerously attractive, I think. And there's one case that you and I worked on where we'll call her author A. Author A had died. She had been a fairly well-known novelist, and I really wanted to publish her last novel, one of her last novels, which had not been noticed by the literary critics of the time, because they regarded the first 2 or 3 novels that she published, which were of a certain style, as, well, this is what she must always have been like. But they hadn't realized that there was a big change later, and I found one. And you helped me find the family because you gave me a name. How did you know that name? Did you just do some research of your own, or did you just?
I did some Googling.
Oh, okay.
I did some like arcane Googling though, not your kind of, not your everyday run of the mill Googling.
So you gave me a name, and I emailed this person who was in a different country, and that person said, oh my goodness, you need to talk to my grandmother. And in the end, the daughter of, the granddaughter of author A is the one I have been communicating with. But we all ran up against a problem. There is no will. And without that, Curtis Brown can't get involved, because I was going to shepherd this family into the arms of Curtis Brown so they could be happy they're dealing with an agent and not just with me, who could be anyone. But Curtis Brown can't take it off because there is no clear title, and that was a deal breaker, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be very careful that we don't pay the wrong people, you know, because we take that money into trust when it comes to us from a publisher, and you know, we have to be sure we've done our due diligence. And what's really interesting about well, I say it's interesting to me about how, you know, about how inheritance law works is that if you don't leave a will, and it is, you know, it's extraordinary the number of people who die intestate and leave their families with awful problems. So, you know, if you're listening to this and you haven't written a will, please write a will.
I second that, please.
Yeah.
Write a will.
But you know, there is a kind of often a clear dissent of, and actually, I mean, a problem that I find far more often is that someone does leave a will, but they don't mention their books.
Yes.
Really
yes.
common, actually incredibly common, far more common than you would think, even for quite prolific writers, because often people are writing a will at the end of their life and they've been inactive as a writer, perhaps for decades. And you know, as well, I like a big kind of sort of looming statue in the kind of garden of this landscape is ebooks. And for the longest time, ebooks weren't a thing, obviously. And, you know, we just didn't have the technology to do that. And so what would happen, particularly, you know, if you weren't a literary writer, if you were kind of writing commercially or, you know, genre books, that kind of thing, you know, say you were writing a crime novel every year, you had no expectation that those would remain in print. There was no capacity to do that. You know, you would write it, your fans would go out, they would buy it, they would enjoy it, they'd take it to the charity shop or pass it on or leave it on the shelf at home. And, you know, once that kind of first wave of interest had gone and the print run had been sold off, the publisher wouldn't print again. And as an author, that was just how it worked. You know, you just kind of, that one floated on by and the next one came out and you looked ahead. And there was no notion that there might one day be a world in which technology would allow a publisher to reissue that book. Yeah, exactly. And so people simply didn't make any allowance for that in how they left their legacies. And so what might happen, and I've had this happen too many times to count, and it is so heartbreaking when it does, is they would leave it in what is known as your residuary estate, which is where everything else goes. And what will happen is someone will leave their residuary estate to 15 charities who will suddenly all have a 15th of very little money, you know, and you'll get a lovely publisher and they'll come along and they'll say, I want to offer you £500 to publish this. And you have to wrangle 15 people, you know, 11 of whom don't care, and who are all, you know, going to be on the receiving end of less than 50 quid.
And
you know, it
would cost them more in administration for the charities.
Exactly. And you know, exactly. And yeah, for charities, they simply can't justify it. So things can end up actually being orphaned, even though they aren't orphan. In that case. So I knew an example of an author that I don't represent and that I will nevertheless leave anonymous, who left her estate to half to the RSPCA, half to the NSPCC, and the two charities couldn't agree on the warranty language for contracts. So nothing was ever republished because it just couldn't. So and there was interest all the time in her because she was a fantastic writer who's still entirely unavailable. And that's why it's really sad.
Can a beneficiary refuse to be a beneficiary of a will?
Yes. Yeah.
So they can. So someone noble could say, no, please take it all. But far and few between. Whoa, gosh, that's hard work. Yes. When do you decide that you've searched long enough? How long do you give yourself before you decide, okay, we cannot find it? It is now dead.
I mean, to be honest, it's usually when every avenue has been exhausted, you know, and you learn your kind of, you know, when you've gone through the phone book and you've bought every kind of ancillary will that, you know, every kind of sort of descendant that you can think of, and you've kind of, you know, your letters have gone unanswered, and at that point you just have to say, well, I'm only human. You know. And I mean, the worst thing actually is if someone dies abroad, because there are just we actually have a brilliant system in the UK where if you die here and your probate is granted here, you are automatically on the government's probate system and anyone can audit your will. which you can get for £1.50 and it arrives almost immediately. And that is so, I mean, I must have reunited
so many
people with hundreds of thousands of pounds through using that system, just where but yeah, if someone dies in France, you're stuffed.
Yeah. I think it's a little different in Scotland. I think Scots law, it's more complicated.
Yeah, and Northern Ireland.
Scotland.
Yeah.
I haven't tried that. Okay. And we were considering trying to republish an author who died in the States, and we took a look at the regulations in the state where this person had died, and we just said, no, absolutely not. We cannot physically go there. We're not going to pay someone to go to the courthouse and get a copy. This is impossible. Yeah, awful complications. So to sum up, who would you say the agent is working for the author, or for the publisher, or for someone else?
For a front list agent, 100% for the author, always. Like, I mean, I would say even for estates, it's still 99%. Our job is to get them the best terms that they can possibly get, and if their publisher is like, well, really, it would be much easier for us if we, could pay this instead of that, or if we could remit that royalty instead of this one, or if the license could be 15 years instead of 10, like for us, we're saying like, no, that's not good value for money for our clients. And also, I mean, for a good example of this actually is, when I say term of copyright, that means life plus 70 years. Publishers very often want to buy rights for term of copyright. But what happens with that is that, a lovely enthusiastic editor might buy the book, and then 15 years later, they will leave. And in fact, quite probably 2 years later, they will leave, because, the publishing is a very competitive industry, and often to get promoted, you have to leave and go somewhere else. And that book can just rot there. So long as it is selling enough copies to not fall technically out of print under the terms of the contract, it will just fall out of print. So I always say that a license should be 10 years, ideally, because that means that everybody gets to reassess at the end. Because what I'm doing is I'm looking after that person's legacy, and I have to think, okay, so say there are 55 years of copyright left, I want people to be engaging with that writer's work for the next 55 years. And if it is stuck on a backlist with a cover from the 1990s and everyone is disinterested, it doesn't help anyone apart from the publisher, who gets to sit on those rights for the rest of all time.
And very often I think that the publishers who sit on the rights, they could not care less. Twice I've been in the situation where I've wanted the rights for one particular work, which is only a tiny part of the oeuvre of a big name publisher, and I've been really very nervous about approaching the agent, in both cases not you, because I knew that if I drew attention to the fact that another publisher wanted this particular book, the Sleeping Dog publisher will go, oh, actually, no, my bone, no one's having it. And luckily, the agent in both cases has been extremely skillful at securing me the book I wanted at a fair rate, but also pacifying the gigantic publisher by letting them, renew the rights and so on. But it's a sense of competition. Publishers are always competing with each other. And if we're competing over a particular book or a property, we want to release as little information as possible. So we too have to trust the agents to do the best for us as well as for the author. And it's trust, isn't it? Trust and a good working relationship.
And obviously a lot of the time your interests align. Like if an enthusiastic publisher wants to bring a book back, that can only be good for the author. Yes. And so it's in the agent's interest, in looking after the author's interest, to make sure that book happens. But sometimes also an author's relationship with their big publisher is really important, and you might have to make the call that it's and that's always an uncomfortable conversation, but also that is another key element of our role, is that we have the uncomfortable conversation instead of the author or the estate having to have it.
And that's what the agent is for. So I'm thinking about Winnie the Pooh. There was recently a slasher horror film made of Winnie the Pooh, which got around the copyright very, very cleverly. Can you explain the background?
So that's called Blood and Honey. And do you know, actually, I don't quite understand. I mean, it's an exceptionally complicated thing. And actually, like Milne and I know, so, you know, like, don't quote me on this because I know so little about it. But so Milne died a long time before E.H. Shepard, who illustrated the books. And also Disney own a ton of poo from, you know, those gorgeous like 1990s cartoons that I grew up on. And so, but Milne died in the, God, when did Milne die? The 50s?
Could have been, yeah.
Yes, I think I want to say 1956. And so that is a period of time in American copyright law where actually it was shorter than Life Plus 70, but for individual books, not for the author's work entirely. So basically, some of the Winnie the Pooh books from that he wrote earlier in his writing period actually were like 90 years from publication, which elapsed last year, which is what allowed the kind of window. So anyway, it's extremely complicated, and I don't know enough about it to pronounce on it, but basically you can, particularly towards the end of an author's copyright period, and A.A. Milne will go out of copyright in a few years' time, you start to get these kind of sort of almost leaks in the kind of, you know, in that sort of safety wall that you build for a client's work, which is, you know, protected by copyright legislation. And you start to have things, particularly that were written in the 1920s and 30s and published in America, where water kind of, you know, it's like the rivulets of water start to kind of seep in through the holes. But yes, very complicated.
Oh goodness me.
And that's kind of, you know, that's the tangle that we all live off of on a day-to-day basis, that kind of thing. It's very, very complex.
Do you make any preparations when you know that an author is about to come out of copyright? And, you know, do you tell the publishers? Do you say, by the way, do you realize, or do you just sit back and
we work really hard during those last 10 years, firstly to leave behind, like, because you know, there are lots of different opinions about the worth of copyright, particularly, I mean, not so much for when people are alive, but like for how long it extends after you are dead. But in my experience, for the majority of writers' works, actually having a family member, you know, whether or not they've employed an agent who is advocating for and controlling what goes out into the world, is a positive thing. And what happens, which is so sad, is that when that period ends, there is no longer any reason for, you know, I can't remain involved. You know, no income is going to anybody because it's now in the public domain. And what happens actually is a lot of stuff just falls out of print because nobody notices it. You know, we represented until a few years ago a really interesting, I'm sure she's on your radar, May Sinclair, the kind of suffragist. So published.
May Sinclair, yes, of course, I know. May Sinclair,
who wrote The Life and Death of Harriet Freen, and you know, some really extraordinary books.
And she invented the stream of consciousness.
She did, yeah, she did.
She coined it.
Yeah, and she, and she's a writer I love. And it was really interesting. Has a really interesting place in 20th century literature. And she, you know, she's out of print, and there is, I think there's maybe one in the British Library Women's Writer Series, but, you know, there's nothing I can do about that. You know, I can't justify spending any time telling people to republish May Sinclair because I can't make any money, which I do, you know, I don't have to do that much of, thankfully, but I do have to be able to justify what I do on a day-to-day basis, you know, and so the fact that copyright has elapsed now means that there is nobody left to think. And also a lot of what agents do, you know, whether it's for living writers or for, you know, or for dead ones, is we are thinking about the whole body of work. We're thinking about the whole career. We're thinking about what moves everything forwards, not just like, what can we do for this one book, or like, what's the right thing to do today? Like, how are we setting stuff up? And that, to go back to your question about, you know, what happens at the end, we spend that last decade really trying to kind of shore up everything and, you know, generate as much interest as possible so that, you know, when we can't help anymore, there is enough kinetic energy, I guess, that you've already got going that will keep that writer kind of above the waterline. That's the ideal.
Yeah, I'm thinking about John Buchan, but there was a very interesting moment. John Buchan came out of copyright in 1991 because EU law changed. He came out of copyright in
Yeah.
91
Hmm.
when it was only 50 years.
Hmm.
Eruption of new editions of John Buchan's works, almost all of them. And then EU law came in and changed it to 70. So suddenly Buchan was back into
Yeah.
copyright. But that had the effect of doing what you've just described, of producing brand new set of new editions. So 20 years later, they were still sitting around in secondhand bookshops, some of them actually in the shelves of Waterstones.
Hmm.
And then new editions came along. So that was a happy accident. And it wasn't just Buchan, it was any other writer who died in 1940. For a few years, they had this
Hmm.
golden moment and then they were dragged back in.
Yeah.
Gosh, it was fun. It was happy days for Buchan people. I think we can open the floor now to questions. Sarah, can we summon you back from the depths of the library?
Hello, hi.
Are there any questions?
There are questions. There's a few questions.
Mhm.
So the first one, could an author book be printed 70 years after it was established that no beneficiaries exist?
Yes. Well, so basically, when the book enters the public domain, so when that 70 years after their death has elapsed, yeah, then essentially the whole problem goes away. Because regardless of who, because copyright cannot be extended after that 70 years, basically the whole problem gets solved for everybody. The problem with that problem is that the probably in that 70 years that person has been entirely forgotten because nobody has been able to publish their books. But if that hasn't happened, then yes, that would be the moment to do it for sure.
Right, the next one, we've got two questions. So the first part, what happens to books that are sold secondhand? And the second part is, should the person who holds copyrights get money from book borrowed by a library?
Oh, well, so that to answer the second one, they actually do get money from books borrowed from the library under a scheme called public lending right, which actually one of my estates was a really fascinating writer and activist called Bridget Brophy campaigned vociferously for public lending right. And it's a really important part of author income and estate income. So writers get I can't remember what, actually, interestingly, Bridget Brophy's dad, John Brophy, who was also a writer, campaigned initially for something he called the Brophy penny, which was this idea that everyone would get 1p every time. I mean, this was, like 100 years ago. So 1p was a bit more money than it is now. But I can't remember what the actual...
It's a small percentage.
Yeah, it's a small percentage. So estates do, they do get money for borrows. I mean, secondhand books are really interesting, and they're a kind of they're a big discussion point actually in like our universe, because one thing you have to consider is that if something was published really widely in paperback in say the 1950s or the 1960s, if a publisher puts out a new edition, they are competing against those secondhand sales. So if I go on Amazon or another global retailer of my choice and look for, I don't know, Strangers and Brothers by C.P. Snow, I could buy Macmillan's edition for £9.99, or I could buy a kind of Penguin paperback probably for 79p. So you have that sort of, and I might be a very nostalgic person who much prefers that little kind of tri-band A format sort of book that smells a bit like, I don't know, a shed. But I think that second, like personally, this is my opinion is Becky Brown, the person. I think, the secondhand book market is a wonderful thing. And I find so many wonderful books secondhand. And obviously, we chop down trees to make books, so they should be read as many times as possible.
I think there was a move recently, a small conglomeration, a small group of secondhand book dealers have banded together to try and give authors back when they make a sale of a secondhand book. And the details have disappeared, but I think it was within the last year.
Yeah, I think it's World of Books who
right,
trialed it.
Yeah.
I think that is still happening. I do think it's a very good idea, although I'm not quite sure logistically how it works. But
they are so big and they sell so many. It's possible that even that their effort alone might produce a little money. It's an interesting idea, though. Should secondhand bookshops also give back something the way libraries do? Anyway, next question.
Can you comment on possible issues of copyright being applied to something created as a published work by AI, artificial intelligence?
Oh, well,
Oh.
actually, do you know what? I've been reading an awful lot about this recently because, and like this is probably too much biographical information, but I sit on the main committee of a body called the Association of Authors Agents, which is the kind of umbrella organization that most literary agencies are a member of, and I chair the IP subcommittee. And so I've spent quite a lot of time in the past few months sat in the Houses of Parliament listening to debates about this. So I can give you a relatively intelligent answer, which is that it is probably an existential threat to copyright AI. It kind of, the way AI, at like what we call AI at the moment, which is basically generative AI. So machines that, like language learning machines, that take a question from you or a prompt and then use millions of pieces of data that they have ingested temporarily and held in their kind of robot minds. Those AIs are, the things they generate are kind of, they're Frankenstein's monsters. They are made up of the discrete intellectual property of thousands and thousands of writers. And like, as an agent, that's incredibly problematic because none of those writers have been paid for their work. And there are going to be massive debates, I think, that have already started about how or even whether writers get remunerated for what has been taken into those machines. And then in terms of how we understand the copyright of what comes out, none of us know yet. It's a brave new world, and I mean that with all the dystopian undertones that it implies. We'll see what happens, but it is going, I think the likelihood is that copyright legislation is going to have to change to factor in how AI works.
And that might clear up a lot of other small anomalies, but that's an excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, a really terrifying one. We need good lawyers to get our heads around that.
Yes, or we can put our heads in the sand.
All right. The next one. What might it cost to license a book by an author who's died, say 40 years ago, but has been out of print for 20 years?
And I would say, in terms of what I've sold sort of individual, and let's say novels for the sake of argument, I'm weighing up lots of things when I do a license. So even if it's almost no money that the publisher is offering, if I think it's a good thing for that book to be in print, then and agents work on commission, so I'm usually taking 15% of what I bring in. So I might, for example, give a publisher a 10-year license for a book and they might only be able to pay me £150, in which case I make £22.50 for what is probably going to be 8 hours work. So I mean, that makes absolutely no sense as a financial as a kind of sum on paper, but I'm thinking of the intangible value of doing that for the author's legacy. I'm also thinking that that will mean there'll be a PDF that I can share with foreign rights publishers and with film people, and there are other benefits. But then at the other end, I've sold individual novels sometimes, if they've been very good and very timely, for say £12,000 through to £20,000.
I can't compete. I don't play in those waters.
Those are the large publishing houses. But for scale, like some very, very famous kind of living writers might be being paid over the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds per book. So in that pond, it is a minnow rather than a goldfish.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. How are the cost of book rights decided? We hear of rights being too exorbitant.
You might hear about them being you might hear that rights are gaining a lot of money, but that might not be the case. Never believe everything the newspapers tell you.
Yeah, I think also that sense of value, like, well, at least as an agent, if you are sending, I'm sometimes sending something just to one person because I think that it's the right thing for them, but often I'm kind of gauging the market. So what I will get for selling the book rights will be what everyone collectively has decided they are worth. So I guess that's a big question in terms of like, how do we convert things like whether we enjoy something into a number.
And if you have an auction situation, if you have a book that's suddenly available and an agent decides, well, I'm going to put this up for auction, and you have 5 or 6 publishers bidding, the prices will go up as in any auction, and then it's inflation based on competition on a foundation of, we think we can sell an awful lot of these, as this text. And how can you measure that?
Yeah. Also, what I would say is that, the kind of average author income is decreasing every year. And at the moment, I think it's something like the mean income for an author is under £10,000. And that was dropped from £11,000 at the beginning of the pandemic. So actually, the vast majority of writers cannot make a living from writing. And that, you can kind of look backwards and work that all out from, maybe they're being paid £2,000 to write a book. So, and there are big questions in there about like, how do we, what price do we put on human creativity, and how do we value writers in society? And, you could have a whole separate Zoom about that.
Yeah. And writing is not everything that a writer does. A writer has all
Exactly.
sorts of other contributions associated with their writing skills. Anyway.
The next question. Does the royalty the author get from the library usage depend on how frequent the book is checked out, or is it a flat fee?
Oh, I don't know. I have always assumed it's on a per book basis.
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's on a per book
Things
basis.
like photocopying. When I was a student and photocopying bits of textbooks for my PhD, I would be paying a percentage because I've made those copies. So it would be on a case by case basis.
Actually, though, that's different. Like, this is very dry, but that's actually different. That goes
Oh,
to something
no.
called the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, the ALCS, and they operate on a pool model.
Okay.
But I think public lending right is a per book payment, I think.
What happens when a book is still in copyright, but the publisher does not have any paperwork? This is an issue with me at present, with a publisher who has collapsed and now relaunched many years later, but with a completely different list and staff.
Now that's interesting. Do you know, like, that is, that's, if someone has the paperwork, then you should be able to establish what's going on. But normally a book contract will have a clause that says if the publisher is liquidated, the rights automatically revert to the author. And I think there's a problem. I don't know actually if that exists in larger legislation about just what happens generally if
if the entity who took out the contract does no longer exist, then they cannot possibly have any rights to that novel, to that work. So
although what's interesting though, so for example, and I come up against this a lot because I am often trying to work out who owns film and TV rights in something that has been made either for film or TV in the past, which is a vastly more complicated landscape than it is for books, because contracts in that world are brutal, much worse than book contracts. But what can happen is if a production company has bought the rights to a novel and they've made it, so they've made their lovely film or their interesting limited TV series or whatever, and then the production company is liquidated, which happens all the time. People who perhaps work in some other area of TV start up a production company, make a few things, and then they're like, no, do you know what, I'm going to go back into development or whatever. If they forget to transfer the assets from their production company to someone else, they go to the state. So sometimes I find that the rights that I'm looking for in something are actually owned by the British state or the Irish state, and then that just kills it. That just kills the whole thing. Nothing can happen then.
Because the state really couldn't care less. It's too busy trying to govern. Yeah.
It's very busy.
Next one. What is a standard royalty on the average heritage work?
I would say it is. The way, for example, that Curtis Brown works is that we have a boilerplate terms with each company. So, we'll have over many decades thrashed out what the royalties are and set precedents with each of the publishers that we work with. So there isn't a standard. There is there is a standard within each of those companies, but there isn't an industry standard. And actually, I think if there was, that would probably be against competition law. So.
Is the publishing situation for British Library crime classics different from the scenario you described?
Which scenario was that though? So British Library crime classics, which are a fantastic series, it really depends what the scenario was actually. But they are, they have so many books on that list as well, and they do them so wonderfully. But yeah, I don't know until I know the scenario. If whoever asked that can briefly say the scenario, then I will come back to that question.
The next one. Is it profitable to publish works that first came out before there was any copyright, like Shakespeare, I suppose? Or is it less profitable because any publisher can publish those works?
it's probably, well, you got the work, let's say an edition of Shakespeare, but what if you present that work, which is out of copyright, and you get really famous authors of the day, Juliet Stevenson, Anton Lesser, Ian McKellen, offering their own interpretation of what that a role in this play was. You pay a fee to those famous authors, so you don't have royalties involved. And that edition might sell absolute shed loads because it's got that added value to do with the out of copyright text. So in that sense, yes, it can be profitable. But just republishing yet another edition of a book, Dickens, Trollope, Hardy, the Brontes, George Eliot, you have to have added value, otherwise why bother? And a bookshop is also not going to buy multiple editions of a work. The Mill on the Floss, 15 different editions. Why would a bookshop want that unless there was something different about each edition to make it worthwhile carrying that and using up that space on the shelves?
I mean, yeah, I would say as well, if you want to, I mean, that's a great answer. And also, if you want to be nerdy about it, go and look, like put David Copperfield into like the Waterstones website or something, and you'll see, 15 different editions. And a lot of what publishers are having to do there is they're also having to make the most beautiful edition. They're having to, because, people often buy classics in a really, particularly like those kind of stone cold classics, in a really aspirational way. So they want a beautiful book and they want it to feel a bit old. And, so those publishers are often actually putting more money into the finishes, and it can be really expensive.
Yeah.
Maybe they're doing a kind of cloth bound hardback, or they're using, putting some kind of gold on it or something. And each of those things, it's very interesting once you kind of know about book production costs. Like if like the letters are a bit raised or a bit debossed or they're shiny, like that's going to have added whole 6p per book,
a ribbon going through it, 1/3 of the cost. Oh my goodness. So
I've got
don't do
one
that.
last question and then we have to wrap up this online talk. So a couple of times you and Nora Berkins have pitched old books on the podcast Blacklisted. Have any resulted in rights being sold, if you're at liberty to say, Becky?
No, I mean, well, for one thing, if you're here and haven't listened to Backlisted, do, because it is such a wonderful podcast in which really erudite, wonderful people discuss old books. But yes, actually, do you know, we've sold tons of books off of talking about them on Backlisted. And it's not, I mean, sometimes people do come to us and say, I heard you talk about this, and are the rights available? But more often we just use it as a kind of, we'll write and say, and we've mentioned it on this podcast that has X thousand listeners, and it just becomes, I mean, but it's not why we talk about them. We talk about them because we love them. And actually a lot of what we talk about is they are in print. But what I would say is that it is a kind of, I think, particularly when you're looking after books that aren't famous but that are wonderful, that hearing about them in dialogue, in a dialogue between two people, it just kind of, you're already welcomed in to that reading experience. And I think that's really helpful. And I think sometimes that's why those books end up being sold, because there's a real sense of like
passion, emotion.
And kind of conversation, which I think is so important.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Becky Brown and Kate MacDonald, again for a fascinating talk called Literary Agents of Dead Authors. I want to thank all the guests who tuned in and asked some very great questions, fascinating questions actually, and hope to see you in our next series, Kate, if we have any more.
Oh, I'm sure we can find some more. Yeah, we can do more.
Want to see more from us? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, or new content alert.